Hi, my name is Matt Steele, and we're going to be talking about building trustworthy applications that can reach millions of users. Our shared customers are choosing cloud apps to meet their productivity needs, all the while their data is exploding in its size and in its value. And what this means is that the app acquisition decisions from years ago were fairly easy, but now those decisions are major trust decisions. These customers are concerned about the security and compliance of their business critical data sets. And this presents an opportunity for you as a trustworthy developer to distinguish yourself and help those customers find the apps that meet their needs securely. So today, we're going to talk about how do you get your app secure? And then how do you get credit for that hard work that you did on securing your app? And then after that, using that, how do you accelerate the adoption of your app? So let's dive in. We're going to start by talking about your first step on onboarding to the Microsoft Cloud, and that's onboarding to the Microsoft Identity Platform. And we're going to go from there to talk about how do I actually build a secure app? So this is where we're talking about code. Then we're going to take a step back from the code and then talk about how do I secure my app's registration? A secure app is about more than just secure code is what we're going to cover there. And then finally, we're going to get to how we accelerate adoption of your app with our customers. So the Microsoft Identity Platform, what's a critical piece and set of capabilities for the Identity Platform? Fundamentally, the Identity Platform enables you to reduce your sign-in friction. So users and customers can use the same accounts that they use to check their mail, to sign into your app, and use the rich integrations that you're building into your app. And when you do that, the Identity Platform takes care of all of the enhanced security and all of the IT policy compliance. It keeps that under the hood, so you don't have to worry about that in your app logic. And that unlocks you to go build rich integrations with that data that exists in the Microsoft Cloud. So what capabilities exist in the Identity Platform? Well, we start with the top left. The Azure portal is where you go to register your app on top of the Identity Platform. And then once you've registered your app and you have that in your organization, you're going to get one of the libraries that we offer, like MSAL, that we're going to talk about in a little bit, and use that to build your application's code so that it's securely consuming the service endpoints that the Identity Platform exposes. And those service endpoints work on many supported identities. They work on Microsoft personal, work, or school accounts, but also social identities. And as I said before, all of this is built on a base of the industry standard protocols that the Identity Platform at Microsoft supports. Once you've done all that onboarding, you can have an awesome amount of data at your fingertips, both in the Microsoft 365 platform as well as other places that Microsoft in the Microsoft Cloud, like the Azure platform. This data enables you to build very rich apps with access to mail, calendar, tasks, alerts, search, events, and other pieces that are critical to a deeply integrated app. So enough about what you can do. Let's just go do it. We're going to figure out how to use MSAL to build a secure app. And then we're going to add some extra data access onto that app by leveraging the Graph Explorer. So what is MSAL? Well, let's talk about modern auth protocols. Modern auth protocols are helping to take us beyond passwords and towards secure and compliant sign-in. And MSAL is built on top of these modern auth protocols as the client library that enables the usage of these protocols. It's a secure implementation of these protocols. And the model is simple. You simply ask for a token, and then you get one back. And all of the security innovation coming from Microsoft happens underneath that layer of code so that your business critical logic doesn't have to change as it calls and asks for a token. On the right of your screen, you'll see all of the quick starts that make it easy to get started with the Identity Platform on any platform that you're using and in any language. So let's jump in and actually do some secure development with MSAL. So I'm going to get out of the slides here, minimize those, and bring up our sample user. And this is the sample user's mail, but he wants to go and register an app. So he's going to go to the Azure portal, like I mentioned before. We're going to log in here and go to Azure Active Directory. And since we're trying to do an app registration, I'm going to find the App Registrations tab. Here, there's one that already exists, but I want to do this from scratch. So we're going to start with a new registration. And we can call it whatever we want at this point. So I look at the name, I look at who can access this app. And since I'm only really building it for my organization, I'm going to leave it on the first option. And that's all I need to do to register my new app. I land right on a screen that helps me understand exactly what the next steps are. And here, what I want to do is go to those quick starts that I talked about before. I'm building a single page app. So I'm going to start with the JavaScript quick start that helps us to build a single page application. So let's go in there. Now, the first step is that it needs to make some changes to my app registration for me. So I'm going to make those changes and just accept the updates to my application. Now I'm going to download the code sample. Code sample downloads right here. And when it's ready, I'm just going to open the file. It should download fairly quickly. Okay, so we open the file. We're going to extract that into my source directory. So I'm going to select my source directory and extract. And since I had one there before, I have to replace the files. But it replaces the files and then brings up my source directory. Now, what I'm going to do is launch a PowerShell window from here. And these instructions are right there in the quick start. So I can install. We take a second to actually do the install. This is using NPM. And then I'm actually going to start. So now my sample app is actually up and running and listening on port 3000. Let's go back to my browser. So here, I already have a bookmark for going to the quick start, which is localhost 3000. I click sign in, and I'm prompted. I've already signed in this browser session, so I don't have to worry about any providing of a password or doing multi-factor authentication. I'm able to actually leverage the existing capability here. And what is the app asking for access to? Sign in and read my profile. So I'm just going to accept that. And now we see welcome sample user. Now I can see the profile of that sample user. And in the background, it's calling Microsoft Graph to get rich data about the user. We get some interesting data here, but now the button's changed. And we can actually, with this sample app, go read the mail of the user we were just looking at. However, it doesn't have access to read mail yet. So this app is built really well, and it actually asks for access incrementally. So it's asking to read mail. I'll accept that because it also seems like a pretty limited permission. And now I see there's all kinds of mails available that I can then pull into my app and do deep integrations on. So that was pretty easy. Let's try to pull up and look at that app inside of Visual Studio. I've already loaded it in Visual Studio, and we can see that it's just a normal JavaScript app. We'll take a look at a few interesting parts of it. The index HTML is just laying out the pieces that we already saw on the app. Let's look at auth config, because this is where some of the interesting values are. You can see that my client ID of my new app is already there. The endpoint of the Microsoft Identity Platform is already there. And the redirect URI that my app is listening on is already there as well. And that's part of the quick start magic of getting started. But let's go down and take a look at some stuff we're going to talk about more later, which is the permissions and scopes that are being requested to actually get access onto the data. And then when we make our subsequent graph request, we see mail.read. Now we're going to come in later and take a look at that and how we might change it to make it work a little bit differently. But for now, let's get back to the slides and talk about what our next steps are. So as you can see, we were up and running very quickly. We didn't really have to write any code, but we had a running sample that we could start inspecting and understanding how it worked with the identity platform. Now let's talk about what we can do to add extra data into our application. So it might be that you don't want to build an application that reads mails. You want to build some other application. And the minute we start talking about bringing extra data into the application, we have to talk about permissions, because you're going to ask your customers to give you permission to their data as part of accessing that data in the Microsoft cloud. And those customers will see an experience like that one on the right to grant access to that data. Now, customers, like we said before, are more likely to grant access if you actually request only the data and only the permissions that your app needs. So requesting a lot of permissions for only a little bit of data tends to scare folks off. And this is a really cool place where security and adoption are actually aligned. The more you make a secure app, the better you're going to be able to accelerate your adoption with customers. Another important thing to remember as you go through this is to use delegated permissions. All of the sample we're looking at uses delegated permissions, so you don't need to worry about that. What are delegated permissions? They're the ability for restricting your app's access to only the user who grants that access. And customers will see that and know, okay, this app is only going to access the user's data who are accessing this app. So whenever you have a signed in user, you want to make sure you're using delegated permissions. Now, how do I figure out the right permissions for the data that I need to access? That's really easy now using some of the integrations we have with the Graph Explorer. So let's go back and take a look at how we use Graph Explorer to understand the least privileged permissions to use with the app. I'm going to open up the browser we had before, and I'm going to type in the way I get to Graph Explorer, which is aka.ms/ge. And here, I'm already logged into Graph Explorer, and I'm going to turn on the preview version of Graph Explorer. Now, on the left, I can decide exactly what calls in Graph Explorer that I want to use to understand how my app works. So I click on Get My Profile, and I can see the same data that we saw in the Quick Start sample before. That's because the Quick Start sample was consuming this JSON data straight out of the Microsoft Graph. But let's say I want to add some extra data into my app. I don't just want my profile or my mail, which is one of the things we looked at before, but I want to add some extra data. So I'm going to go down into Calendar. And let's say I want to get my events for the next week. So I click that, and I see the call up here. Here's the URL that's being used. And then down here is the actual results that get returned. It seems that this user has a new meeting coming up for a project in the next week. Now, one of the questions I have is, that's great. Now I know how to call and get that data in my app. But how do I modify the permissions that my app is asking for? So here we can go to modify permissions, and we see the permissions that map to the data that we're looking at directly in Graph Explorer. And so calendars.read is exactly the permission that I need to add to my app. So let's go modify the app. And we'll do this live in Visual Studio. So first, I'm going to start with mail.read, and we're not going to get mail anymore. We want to get the calendar data that we saw before. So we're going to change that mail.read to calendars.read. Now we're going to go over here to the index, and we're actually going to say, hey, just for the sake of the way it looks, instead of read mail, we're really trying to do read calendar. So that's what our users will see in our app. Now I'm going to go to the graph config, and instead of this endpoint, I'm going to use the endpoint that we saw in Graph Explorer before. So now I have that endpoint configured. I have the auth configured to request the right permission. I've changed the way it looks on the screen. I'm just going to look through the UI code and make sure that I understand what's going on. Here, I see a few things in the UI code that made sense for mail, but don't necessarily make sense for calendar. Now, I want to make sure this is the other place where we're using mail. Let's go back to our Graph Explorer and just look. Is there a subject line here, and is that useful? Yes. That's the subject line on the calendar event in the JSON, so I can use subject to actually launch the data in the app. So let's save all the files that we just looked at. Let's go ahead and stop npm and restart. Our app is listening once again. We'll go back to it here and refresh. And our session is cleared because the app is restarted. So now we're going to sign in. And we had already consented, so we don't get prompted for consent again. And we can see profile just like before, but now we see a read calendar button. And when we click read calendar, we'll see the result is actually a new prompt to ask me as a customer to confirm this read calendar capability. So I'm going to accept. And now I see the result. Instead of mails, I've added calendar access into this app. And it was really simple using Graph Explorer. Now I have a least privileged permission, and I'm confident that I'm only asking for access to the data that my app needs. So it's really easy to add new access, but many of you probably already have apps that are accessing Microsoft Graph. And one of the cool things that's happened over the last year is we've added a lot of least privileged permissions. Those least privileged permissions are new identity and access permissions, new Teams permissions. And it's a good idea to go back and check your app using that Graph Explorer experience and see if your app is overprivileged. For example, if you're using directory permissions like directory.read.all, those are almost always overprivileged permissions, giving you access to way more than your app actually needs access to. And if you're building a Teams app, you should definitely use resource-specific consent. We're in public preview now with resource-specific consent. And that enables your Teams app to only have access to the teams that have installed that app instead of all teams across the company. It'll make it much more likely for your app to get adopted. So we've talked a lot about secure coding. Now let's step back and think about your app registration. It turns out that a secure app needs secure code and a secure app registration. So how do we do that? Well, it's important to do this because app registrations can be compromised too. So just like code and logic can get compromised, mistakes can happen with app registrations, and you want to go through and make sure that you're not making those same mistakes. Now, I've listed a few things that you should double check on this slide, but in just a second, we're going to go through the integration assistant to understand exactly how those work. Let's talk about some of these things that we want to double check on first, though. The first one on the list is review your redirect URLs for ownership. One way that attackers can compromise an app registration is to look for URLs associated with the app registration that the app owner no longer owns. The attacker takes ownership of it, like taking ownership of a DNS name, and now they can get tokens that were directed at your app if your app used implicit grant flow. And that takes us to the second option, implicit grant flow. Now, a better option in the industry now is to use PKCE, PKCE. And that allows us to avoid some of the problems of redirecting tokens through possibly insecure machines. One of the neat things about the MSAL story is that MSAL already supports PKCE. So just like we were saying before, the security innovation happens underneath the MSAL layer, and you don't have to do deep changes in your business logic code. If your app has credentials, it's really important to secure those credentials. Keeping secure credentials means looking for options like using certificates instead of passwords. It also means don't put your credentials checked into code. Don't leave them lying around on a shared drive or shared with your teammates. Find a way to have secure credentials injected as part of the deployment of your app to keep them out of human hands as much as possible. And finally, review the app owners that are on your account. Those app owners are extraordinarily powerful users. They can essentially act as your app or build new code to act as your app anytime they want. So don't go putting 20 or 30 users as owners on your app. Better to keep it down to like 2 to 4 users. Don't put it at 1 either, because if something happens to that person, you'll have a very difficult time. So you need a business continuity story, but you also need a security story and a small number of users that you trust having access to the app. Another important thing to consider is enabling MFA for those users so that you're very confident that when they're accessing, they're doing so in a very secure way. Now, I mentioned the integration assistant before. All of this app registration security and the developing attacks in the ecosystem are hard to keep track of as a developer, and that's why we have the integration assistant. Let's go back to where we originally registered our app. Here we were in the quick start, but if you look down, you can see Integration Assistant as a preview. Now, the first thing I do with the Integration Assistant is I tell it what kind of app I'm building so that it can customize what needs to happen for me. So I'm going to say, evaluate my app registration, and it constructs a checklist of things that I need to do for my app, including everything we just talked about on the last slide. So I can look through this checklist. I can take action on particular things like disabling implicit flow or configuring API permissions. I can also look through very, very specific checklists for basics in development or implementation and end user experience guidance for how this is going to work. I can take it all the way through the life cycle of my app to look at testing hints and integration assistant actions there, releasing, and the things I need to monitor. And so you can see, even in this things I need to monitor, redirect URLs is showing up, just like we talked about on the last slide. So if you go to the integration assistant inside of the Azure portal, it'll be able to tell you the things that you should be checking to keep your app registration secure. So back to the slides. We've talked all about how to have secure code, how to have a secure app registration. Now let's talk about how do we get credit and leverage all that hard work you've done to be secure and build a trustworthy app to distinguish yourself with our shared customers. And the most important thing you can do to distinguish yourself with customers is to establish yourself as a verified publisher with the Microsoft Identity Platform. We're going to dive deep into exactly how you do that. But before we do that, it's important to understand what is the customer experience of acquiring these apps so that you can understand the customer situation that folks find themselves in. So when admins see a request like this, and this is an exact anti-pattern of what I said before, this app is requesting everything in the kitchen sink. When apps and admins see that type of request, it makes them feel like this app ecosystem is risky, and it makes them want to lock down and have more control. And some admins will block all end user consent in their entire organization. And that means end users are going to see an experience like this. Now, it says, go contact your admin to get approval to use this app. Now, that might not be a problem if you're a really small organization. You can call across the room and say, hey, Joe, I need you to approve my app. But in large organizations, no one knows their admin. We end up calling this the brick wall because users run into a brick wall. They don't know who their admin is, and they don't know how to use the app that they felt like was important to their productivity needs. And what app publishers start to see is acquisition graphs that are going down them because end users can't start to organically use their app. Now, the identity platform has a new feature that can help with this particular situation. And it's the admin consent workflow. And enables an experience like what you see on the right. It enables end users, the minute they're blocked, to actually request access directly to their admin. And then admins get notified, get to come to a queue that says, here are all the pending access to apps requests that exist in my organization. This has been in public preview for a while, and we're excited to say it's going to go to general availability here in July. So we recommend all of our customers turning this on, and it'll also help developers to get their app acquired. But it doesn't really address the root cause of what we were talking about before. There's sort of a pairing of root causes that happen. And one is that admins don't feel like they have the control to take fine-grained action on their app ecosystem. And two is that they perceive that that app ecosystem has risks. So to actually give our customers deep protection, it's a collaboration between those customers, developers, and Microsoft. And that's why we're announcing new capabilities to keep the app ecosystem safe. With consent policies, we're giving customers very fine-grained control over which apps can ask for end-user consent for which permissions. And the important thing to note here is that publisher verification requirement you see at the bottom that I talked about before. If you as a developer verify yourself as a publisher, you'll make it through our recommended policies for customers. The other important thing we're announcing is that we have a risk-based consent protection that we're putting into place and has actually been in place already. This protection takes the amazing things that Microsoft is doing with user identity protection and brings them to apps. So we're processing over 171 terabytes of data, running machine learning and artificial intelligence algorithms on top of that data to protect our user identities. And we're beginning to do the same thing for our app identities. And this is all so that our customers feel like this is a safe place to acquire apps. But the action for you as a developer is to go verify yourself as a publisher. And the good news is it's super easy. You can use your organization's MPN ID, or if you don't have an MPN ID, you can sign up for one for free. Bind that to your app in less than 90 seconds, and you're ready to go. You start to get an experience like the one that Apple is getting on the right, with a Twitter-style verification badge that sits right next to your app and lets your customers know that this really is you. It's not somebody else. Publisher verification will become a requirement for the ecosystem as we move forward. So you should get ahead of the game now. And the fact is that admins are already deploying policies that require publisher verification regardless of the ecosystem's requirements. So go to aka.ms/publisher verification and get your app publisher verified immediately. Without it, you're going to have trouble with multi-tenant end user app acquisition. Now, keep in mind, admins are always going to have the option to install apps even if they're not publisher verified. And this won't apply for apps that exist in a tenant where the tenant is trying to consume its own apps. So think about line of business apps. If you're trying to develop apps only for your organization, you don't need to be publisher verified because we assume that that organization has a good hold on its developers. But big developers are already signing up for publisher verification. We can see Apple on this page, and there are a lot more developers who have already engaged in our private preview to get publisher verified. So you want to take action immediately and go get verified. It's very easy, and it's going to become a requirement for the ecosystem. Now, let's say you want to go above and beyond and you want to distinguish yourself even more to increase your app acquisition beyond what publisher verification can do. Well, there's more available here, and that's app attestation and certification available through the Microsoft 365 program. You can go to aka.ms/app certification to take a look. App self-attestation is where developers can log in and provide structured data about their app, about how their app handles data that it requests from customers and how you as a developer take care of that data. It doesn't actually certify anything, but it does help to structure the conversation with customers so customers know where the developer stands on the critical questions that they want to ask. Then app certification is actually having Microsoft and an auditor come in and inspect whether your app is following best practices. That auditor comes in and inspects all of your lines of code to make sure that they are actually following best practices. It's a more involved process, but we've seen many of our developers that have gone through app certification already have great experiences with app acquisition and customers. Customers saying, you passed my security evaluation entirely because you're already Microsoft 365 app certified. So those are the critical things that you need to be thinking about to take advantage of all the trustworthy app coding and app registration maintenance that you're doing as a developer. There's a whole bunch more related Microsoft on-demand sessions for the identity platform. I encourage you to check them out to look at all of the new things that are coming from the identity platform. There's lots of live sessions coming up as well. And this is where, as opposed to this pre-recorded session, someone will be live and talking to you directly, and you can ask questions directly to the speakers. I'll be on those live sessions, and so will my colleagues. There's lots of community connections to consider as you go through and look at the capabilities that we're offering here in Build. And there's lots to do on GitHub and Stack Overflow to engage with the identity platform experts and make progress on getting your app adopted by your customers. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen. I appreciate it. And go publisher verify your app. Take care.